Welcome back. In our previous episode, we listened to St. Paul as he paused his instructions to give some encouraging words to Timothy. Today, Paul will resume his instructions in chapter 5. In particular, Paul will address charitable contributions to widows. That topic might not sound like it has much relevance to our lives today, but you might be surprised. Let's get started. Verse 1. Do not speak harshly to an older man, but address him as a father, to younger men as brothers, to older women as mothers, to younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. Okay, brief pause. I know we've only covered one sentence here, but I want to stop and take note of something. Paul tells Timothy to treat younger women as sisters with all purity. I think this is a good place to ask the question, what was Timothy's marital status? We know Paul was unmarried, but what of Timothy? Well, we're never told directly in the Bible, but I think there's a few things that we could consider as evidence. First, we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that Paul had a preference for remaining single if you're planning to devote yourself to service in the church. As we saw in chapter 3, he assumes the candidates for the pastorate and the diaconate might be married men. Those men will be tied down to one spot. But as for Paul's personal traveling group, it would make sense for Paul to only recruit men whose single-minded devotion matches his own. The second thing I would point out is that Timothy's wife, if he had one, is never mentioned. Not in the book of Acts, nor in any of these letters. One place you might expect to find her mentioned is at the end of Paul's second letter to Timothy. Paul closes the letter by giving personal greetings to several of his colleagues. If Timothy had a wife or family, it would be tremendously rude for Paul not to greet them as well. Lastly, we have Paul's advice here in verse 2. He tells Timothy to treat the young women like sisters with absolute purity. Now, that advice is good whether he's married or not, but it sounds more like the sort of thing that you tell a young man who is unmarried and who wants to avoid scandal. Therefore, my conclusion is that Timothy most likely was unmarried like Paul. Okay, on to the stuff about widows. Let's keep rolling. Verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows. If a woman has children and grandchildren, they should first learn their religious duty to their own family and make some repayment for their parents, for this is pleasing in God's sight. The real widow, left alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but the widow who lives for her pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give these commands as well, so that they may be above reproach. And anyone who does not provide for relatives, especially family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be put on the list if she's not less than 60 years old and has been married only once. She must be well attested for her good works, as one who has brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the feet of the saints, helped the afflicted, and devoted herself to doing good in every way. Okay, we'll stop again. Paul says we're talking about honor being given to widows, but that word doesn't mean what you might think it is, namely a form of recognition and praise. In this instance, he's talking about material assistance, or money, being given to widows. However, resources are limited, even more then than it is today. Therefore, Paul is giving some criteria for who to prioritize when giving out the aid. There are 3 criteria that he lays out here. First, the widow needs to be without close relatives who can help her out. If she does have relatives, those people should be doing their duty before God and supporting her. A second requirement that we'll come back to in a bit is that she must be under the age of 60. And lastly, she needs to be morally upright and helpful to the whole Christian community. There are 2 things I want to point out about this section. First, there is a quote from Servant of God Dorothy Day which occasionally makes the rounds. She said, "The gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving and undeserving poor." It's a well-meaning quote, motivated by the fact that we don't deserve the help we get from God, and yet God helps us. Therefore, the idea goes that we should pass it along by being uncritically generous and providing assistance even to those who we deem unworthy. And I think this is a very Christian sentiment. However, when I hear this quote, I think of St. Paul's advice about giving assistance to widows. Paul recognizes that in a world of limited resources, you need to do as much good you can with the little that you have. So Paul absolutely tells us to be discerning, first by kinds of means testing, that is, by making sure the money goes to the absolutely needy, people who have no one else. And second, he puts a moral criteria on receiving aid. He doesn't want to see aid going to gossips and drunkards and immoral people, even if that person is a widow. So while certain well-meaning Catholics might quote Dorothy Day in saying that we should be uncritical in our giving, St. Paul says otherwise. The second thing I would point out is a theme that I return to again and again in my Bible study videos. If you've listened to my other studies, you'll know that I despise the doctrine, followed by many Protestants, which asserts that a Christian cannot lose his or her salvation. Once you've found friendship with God, that's it. You're good, no going back. That doctrine is called once saved, always saved, and it boggles my mind. It's contradicted dozens of places throughout the New Testament. This passage contains one such example. Paul says that any Christian who refuses to help a widowed relative has denied and disowned the faith, and is worse than an unbeliever. Note that Paul doesn't say the person was never a believer in the first place, nor does he say the person has ceased believing in Jesus. He acknowledges the person is a believer, but has departed from the faith by way of clear, grave violation of the fourth commandment. Put those two descriptions together, denying the faith and worse than an unbeliever. Paul would never say that about a person who is saved. So to combine those two descriptions and apply those to a person who forsakes a relative means he's calling into question that person's salvation. If believers in Jesus were forever secure in their ultimate fate, there would be no room for Paul to make such a statement. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 11, but refuse to put younger widows on the list. For when their sensual desires alienate them from Christ, they want to marry, and so they incur condemnation for having violated their first pledge. Besides that, they learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house, and they are not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households, so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us, for some have already turned away to follow Satan. We'll pause again here. We mentioned before that Paul wanted for those officially enrolled as widows to not be above the age of 60. Now he's giving a few reasons. First, he's observing that a woman below the age of 60 has a lot of years left, and during that time being supported by the church, he foresees them becoming bored and lazy, and ultimately becoming gossips or worse, thus casting a shadow on the community as a whole. There's probably some comparisons we could make here today, with the social problems we've seen with young people delaying marriage, but let's not dwell on that. In verses 11 and 12, he gives a different reason, something peculiar. He says that if they enter the roster of widows too young, their youthful passions will lead them to want to remarry. Now, ordinarily, that's not a bad thing. At the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul specifically says that a widow can and should remarry a Christian man. But in this instance, Paul says that she would incur condemnation for doing so. Why? Because she will have violated her first, in the Greek, pistis. Now, pistis is a Greek word we use for faith and belief. However, a woman doesn't violate her beliefs by getting remarried. So you'll see many translations go for a more obscure translation of the word pistis, namely the word pledge. Paul is saying that by getting remarried, they'd be violating their first pledge. Well, what kind of pledge does one violate by getting remarried? Logically, it would be a vow to not get married, a vow of celibacy. If you recall in the previous chapter, I mentioned a lowbrow critique of the Catholic Church. Paul tells Timothy to be on guard against those who ban marriage. Anti-Catholics will often seize upon that passage to say that Paul is warning about the Catholic Church, which has various groups that take vows of celibacy. But this is obviously not the case, because here in the very next chapter, Paul is talking about holding women accountable to a vow of celibacy they make when entering the enrollment of widows. So in this instance, we can plausibly refer to this as the Order of Widows, a pious group of celibate women whose role is to assist the community in various ways, a prototype of religious orders that would later evolve in the Catholic Church. Okay, let's finish up this chapter with one final line. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her assist them. Let the church not be burdened, so it can assist those who are real widows. And with this final line, Paul summarizes this topic by reiterating the requirement to enroll only real widows, which he has previously defined as pious women with no other relatives to help them and who are over the age of 60. This serves as a capstone to the topic as he shifts to other things. And with that, we'll close for today. See you next time.